I moved to Cedarville a few months ago, looking for a fresh start. The town was charming, with its quaint shops, friendly neighbors, and tree-lined streets. It felt like the perfect place to leave behind the chaos of my previous life. One afternoon, as I wandered aimlessly through the narrow streets, I stumbled upon a little antique shop called Timeless Treasures. The shop was nestled between a bakery and a bookstore, almost as if it wanted to remain hidden. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to step inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, a shiver ran down my spine. The air inside was musty, and the dim lighting cast eerie shadows across the room. Shelves were cluttered with an assortment of objects, from dusty books to porcelain dolls with cracked faces. As I wandered through the maze of artifacts, I felt a strange sensation, as if the eyes of the dolls were following my every move. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, I found myself drawn deeper into the shop. That's when I saw it, tucked away in a corner display case, an antique pocket watch. It was beautiful, with intricate engravings on its surface and a faint, almost ethereal glow. The hands of the watch were frozen in time, stuck at exactly 3:15. I couldn't explain why, but something about it called to me, urging me to take it home. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a vacant stare, watched me intently as I approached the counter with the watch in hand. "You be careful with that," he said in a raspy voice, his eyes never leaving mine. "It's more than just a timepiece." I nodded, dismissing his warning as nothing more than an old man's eccentricity. Little did I know that this seemingly innocent object would soon unravel my life into a waking nightmare. That night, as I settled into bed, I placed the watch on my bedside table. At first, everything was normal. The wind rustled the leaves outside, and the distant sound of crickets provided a calming backdrop. But as the clock struck midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud ticking sound. It echoed through the room, each tick reverberating in my chest. Confused and half asleep, I glanced at the watch. To my shock, the hands were moving, clicking steadily towards 3:15. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, I noticed the shadows on the walls. They were no longer still, but flickering and dancing as if alive. A cold chill settled over the room, and I felt an oppressive weight bearing down on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a deep sense of unease crept into my bones. When I finally drifted back to sleep, I was plagued by nightmares. Dark figures loomed over me, whispering indecipherable words in my ear. I could feel their breath against my skin, and I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. As I sat up in bed, I realized the watch was now in my hand, though I was certain I had left it on the table. A deep sense of dread settled over me as I tried to rationalize the impossible. The days that followed were no better. I became acutely aware of a presence in my house, something sinister lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Shadows moved where there should be none, and objects disappeared only to reappear in strange places. The air grew colder, and the ticking of the watch became a constant companion, echoing through the halls even when I left it behind in another room. I started seeing things, too, like reflections in the mirror that didn't match my own. Once, I glimpsed a shadowy figure standing at the end of my hallway, watching me with hollow eyes. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I blinked, it was gone, leaving nothing but an icy chill in its wake. I knew I had to do something before I lost my grip on reality. But where do you turn when the source of your terror is something you invited into your own home? Little did I know, the nightmare was only just beginning. As the days wore on, the strange occurrences in my home became more frequent and impossible to ignore. What started as unsettling whispers and fleeting shadows grew into something far more sinister. I began to hear distinct voices echoing through the halls, a cacophony of murmurs that filled the silence with an oppressive weight. Sometimes, I could swear they were calling my name, taunting me from the shadows. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness enveloped the town, the activity in the house escalated to a new level of terror. I was in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. My heart leapt into my throat as I cautiously made my way toward the noise, the creaking floorboards announcing my every step. The kitchen was in disarray. Cabinets hung open, dishes were scattered across the floor, and the air was thick with an unearthly chill. The watch, which I had left in the bedroom, now lay on the kitchen table, its hands spinning wildly as if caught in a vortex of time. My pulse quickened as I realized that whatever was haunting me was becoming bolder, more aggressive. Panicked, I grabbed the watch and dashed back to my room, determined to lock it away in a drawer. But as I placed it inside and turned the key, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the lights and plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any source of light, and when I finally managed to illuminate the room, I saw it, the shadowy figure from my nightmares. It stood at the foot of my bed, its form barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, filling the room with a suffocating malice. The air crackled with a sinister energy, and I was rooted to the spot, unable to move or scream. "Who are you?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the sound of my pounding heart. The figure didn't respond, but the air around it seemed to pulse with anger and desperation. I felt a sharp, icy pain in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I heard the faint ticking of the watch mingling with my own heartbeat. Terrified and overwhelmed, I did the only thing I could think of. I fled. I ran from the house, not stopping until I reached the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The night was eerily silent, the town seemingly oblivious to the horrors that had invaded my home. With nowhere else to turn, I found myself at the doorstep of Dr. Marcus Bennett, the local folklore expert whom I had heard about through a mutual acquaintance. He was known for his eccentricity, often delving into the paranormal and unexplained. I hoped he might have answers, or at the very least, believe my story. Dr. Bennett answered the door, his eyes widening in surprise as I stumbled into his study, visibly shaken. The room was cluttered with books and artifacts from various cultures, a testament to his lifelong obsession with the supernatural. "Please," I pleaded, clutching the watch tightly in my hand. "You have to help me." He took one look at the watch and his expression turned grave. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I recounted the events of the past weeks, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. As I spoke, Dr. Bennett listened intently, his face growing more serious with every detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "This watch," he began slowly, "is no ordinary timepiece. It's a vessel, a conduit for something far more dangerous than you can imagine." He explained that the watch had a dark history, one tainted by tragedy and vengeance. According to local lore, it once belonged to a man named Edward Langley, who had been wrongfully accused and executed for a crime he didn't commit. His spirit, consumed by a need for justice, had become trapped within the watch, haunting anyone unfortunate enough to possess it. Dr. Bennett's words sent a chill down my spine. It all made sense now. The voices, the shadows, the relentless torment. I was living under the shadow of a vengeful spirit, one that wouldn't rest until it found peace or destruction. "We have to perform a ritual," Dr. Bennett concluded, his tone resolute. "It's the only way to free the spirit and break its hold over you." Though terrified, I nodded in agreement. I was willing to do whatever it took to rid myself of this nightmare. But as I left Dr. Bennett's study, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I couldn't shake the sensation that Edward Langley's spirit was aware of our plans, and that it would do everything in its power to stop us. The following days were a blur of anxiety and preparation. Dr. Bennett and I spent hours researching and gathering everything we would need for the ritual. His study became a war room of sorts, cluttered with ancient tomes, candles, and talismans meant to protect us from the spirit's wrath. Despite his assurances, a heavy sense of dread settled over me like a shroud, suffocating any hope I had of returning to normalcy. The night of the ritual arrived with a heavy, oppressive air that pressed against my skin, filling my lungs with an icy breath. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows over Cedarville. As I made my way to the site of the ritual, an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of town, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified, a reminder that Edward Langley's spirit was close, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. Dr. Bennett met me at the chapel, his expression grim but determined. The interior of the building was dimly lit, candles flickering against the cracked stone walls and casting eerie shapes that danced in the corners of my vision. The air was thick with incense, and an altar had been prepared in the center of the room, covered with symbols I didn't recognize but trusted were necessary. "We must begin," Dr. Bennett said, his voice low and steady. "Time is of the essence." I nodded, clutching the watch tightly in my hand, feeling its cold metal pulse with a life of its own. As we began the ritual, Dr. Bennett recited incantations in a language I couldn't understand. The words echoed through the chapel, vibrating through the air and resonating in my bones. The candles flickered wildly, casting shadows that twisted and writhed like living creatures. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath forming misty clouds in front of me. I felt a presence gather around us, an oppressive weight pressing down, as if the very air had taken on a malevolent will. As the incantation reached a fever pitch, the watch in my hand grew colder, the ticking growing louder and more insistent. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind tore through the chapel, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. I gasped, stumbling backward, only for Dr. Bennett to grab my arm and steady me. "Stay focused," he urged, his grip firm and reassuring. "The spirit is here, but we can't falter now." In the pitch black, I felt an unnatural chill creep up my spine, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My senses were heightened, every sound magnified in the oppressive silence that followed. I could hear the faintest whisper of a voice, deep and resonant, speaking directly into my mind. "Why do you seek to imprison me?" the voice intoned, a mix of sorrow and rage. "I demand justice for what was done." I shivered, the words reverberating in my skull, but I forced myself to respond, my voice shaking. "We're trying to help you, Edward," I pleaded. "We want to free you, to bring you peace." For a moment, the presence seemed to hesitate, the air crackling with uncertainty. But then, the rage returned, a palpable force that pushed against us, threatening to break the circle of protection. "Lies!" the spirit roared, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "You seek only your own salvation. My vengeance shall not be denied." The pressure in the room intensified, the very ground beneath us trembling with the spirit's fury. I could feel the edges of my consciousness fraying, the boundary between the living world and the spirit realm blurring dangerously. Dr. Bennett's voice cut through the chaos, a steady anchor in the storm. "And focus on the watch," he instructed urgently. "Use it to draw the spirit in. We must bind it before it breaks free." With shaking hands, I held the watch aloft, feeling its weight pulling me deeper into the maelstrom of energy swirling around us. The ticking grew impossibly loud, drowning out my thoughts, and I could feel the spirit's presence coalescing, drawn inexorably toward the timepiece. As the spirit's form began to materialize before me, I was struck by a profound sense of sorrow. The figure of Edward Langley, his features contorted by anguish and rage, appeared within the circle, his eyes locking onto mine. There was a moment, a fleeting instant, where I saw the man he had once been, wronged and seeking redemption. "Edward, please," I implored, tears brimming in my eyes. "Let us help you. We can make it right." His expression flickered, the fury waning for a heartbeat, before the overwhelming force of his anger surged back. I could feel his power clawing at my mind, a desperate attempt to break free and exact his revenge. But before he could act, Dr. Bennett completed the ritual, his voice ringing out with authority and finality. The symbols around us flared to life, blazing with an otherworldly light that seared the darkness. The air crackled with energy, and I watched as the spirit was pulled toward the watch, the light enveloping it and binding it within. There was a final, heart-wrenching wail, a cry of despair and longing, before the spirit was drawn fully into the watch. The room fell silent, the oppressive presence lifting, leaving behind an echo of what had been. I collapsed to the floor, the weight of the ordeal crashing over me in waves. Dr. Bennett was by my side in an instant, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, helping me to my feet. I nodded, though my mind was still reeling from what we had just experienced. The watch lay in my hand, its surface cold and inert, the ticking silenced. But I knew that it was not over. Not yet. "We need to make sure this never happens again," I said, my voice resolute despite the exhaustion that threatened to drag me under. "Edward deserves justice. We have to find a way to clear his name." Dr. Bennett agreed, and together we vowed to uncover the truth behind Edward Langley's wrongful conviction. But as we left the chapel, a shadow seemed to linger in the corner of my vision, a reminder that the past is not so easily laid to rest. In the days following the ritual, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Although we had managed to bind Edward Langley's spirit, I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. The weight of his anguish still lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the injustice he had suffered. Determined to honor my promise and clear his name, I delved into the history of Cedarville, seeking the truth buried beneath years of silence and deceit. I spent countless hours poring over old records, newspaper articles, and court documents, piecing together the events that led to Edward's tragic fate. The deeper I dug, the more sinister the story became. It turned out that Edward had been a respected member of the community, a craftsman known for his skill and integrity. But when a prominent businessman was found murdered, all evidence inexplicably pointed to Edward. The trial had been swift, the verdict predetermined by a town eager to see justice served, even at the expense of an innocent man. Dr. Bennett aided me in my research, his knowledge of the town's history proving invaluable. Together, we uncovered a web of lies and corruption that reached the highest echelons of Cedarville society. It seemed that Edward had been set up, framed for a crime he didn't commit to protect someone far more powerful. But without concrete evidence, the truth remained frustratingly out of reach, hidden beneath layers of conspiracy and deceit. As I uncovered more about the past, the sense of being watched returned, a constant pressure that weighed heavily on my shoulders. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, a lingering effect of the haunting, but deep down, I knew that something, or someone, was determined to keep the truth from coming to light. Strange occurrences began to plague my life once again. Doors creaked open in the dead of night, footsteps echoed through empty rooms, and the air in my home felt thick with an unseen presence. One evening, as I sat in my living room surrounded by stacks of dusty records and papers, I heard a noise that set my nerves on edge, a soft, deliberate tapping coming from the hallway. My heart raced as I rose to my feet, the fear that had become so familiar returning with full force. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the source of the sound, the beam slicing through the darkness and revealing nothing but shadows. As I reached the end of the hallway, the tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a cold, oppressive silence. I turned slowly, expecting to see the shadowy figure of Edward Langley once more, but instead, I was met with something far more sinister. A message scrawled across the wall in what looked like dark, dripping ink. It read, "You will never uncover the truth." My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was a trick, a cruel joke, but deep down, I knew that the message was a warning, a threat from those who wanted to keep Edward's story buried. Determined not to be intimidated, I pushed forward with my investigation, reaching out to anyone who might have information about the case. Slowly but surely, I pieced together a list of names, people who had been involved in the trial and the events leading up to Edward's conviction. One name, in particular, stood out: Thomas Harrington, a wealthy landowner who had been a close associate of the murdered businessman. Dr. Bennett and I managed to track down Harrington, who was now an old man living in a decrepit mansion on the outskirts of town. When we arrived at his doorstep, he seemed frail and haunted, a shadow of the powerful figure he once was. His eyes, though clouded with age, still held a spark of defiance as he regarded us from his doorstep. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice shaky but resolute. "We're here about Edward Langley," I replied, holding his gaze steady. "We know he was innocent, and we're going to prove it." Harrington laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that echoed through the empty halls of his mansion. "You think you can change the past? You're wasting your time. Undeterred, I pressed on. You framed him, didn't you? You and the others set him up to protect yourselves. His expression shifted, anger flaring in his eyes. You don't know what you're talking about. Edward was guilty, and nothing you do will change that. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the cracks in his facade. I knew we were close to the truth, and I refused to back down. Tell us what happened, I urged, my voice firm. Tell us the truth, and maybe you can find some redemption. Harrington hesitated, his bravado faltering as he weighed his options. I could see the conflict playing out within him, the years of guilt and denial wearing him down. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he relented, motioning for us to enter. Inside, Harrington recounted the events of that fateful night, his voice tinged with regret. He revealed that the businessman had been murdered by a rival who stood to gain from his death, a man who had paid off several key figures in the town to pin the blame on Edward. Harrington had been complicit in the cover-up, his own interests served by the false conviction. As he spoke, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. At last, we had the truth, the evidence needed to clear Edward's name. But just as relief washed over me, a chill swept through the room, and the lights flickered ominously. The air grew cold, and I felt the familiar presence of Edward Langley's spirit. For a moment, I feared that his anger would return, that the fragile peace we had achieved would shatter. But instead, I felt a profound sense of calm, a gentle warmth that wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. The room brightened, and I knew that Edward had found the justice he sought. With Harrington's confession in hand, Dr. Bennett and I set out to clear Edward's name and bring those responsible for the conspiracy to justice. It was a long and arduous journey, but the weight of the truth propelled us forward, illuminating the darkness that had overshadowed Cedarville for far too long. And though the shadows still lingered at the edges of my vision, a reminder of the past and the spirits that dwell within, I knew that we had done right by Edward Langley. His spirit could finally rest, and I could begin to rebuild my life, free from the hauntings of the past. With Thomas Harrington's confession in hand, a new chapter began for both Cedarville and me. As Dr. Bennett and I worked tirelessly to bring the truth to light, it felt like the entire town was waking from a long, oppressive slumber. The revelation of the conspiracy that had wronged Edward Langley sent shockwaves through the community, and slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The local newspaper ran a series of articles exposing the corrupt dealings of the past, and soon after, a full investigation was launched. Those who had conspired against Edward faced the weight of justice at last, their reputations shattered, and their misdeeds brought to light. It was bittersweet vindication, knowing that Edward's name would finally be cleared after all these years. But the victory was tainted by the knowledge of what had been lost. As the truth unfolded, I found myself reflecting on everything that had transpired. The haunting, the fear, and the relentless pursuit of justice had changed me in ways I never anticipated. I felt a newfound strength in facing the darkness, a resilience that had been forged through the trials I'd endured. Edward's spirit had taught me that the past could never truly be buried, but it could be redeemed. One afternoon, as I sat in Dr. Bennett's study, surrounded by the evidence of our success, he turned to me with a contemplative expression. "You've done a great thing, Anne," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "But what now? What will you do with this newfound knowledge?" I paused, considering his question. The watch, the catalyst for all that had happened, sat on the table between us. Though it no longer ticked with the malevolent energy it once held, I still felt its weight, both literal and metaphorical. "I think it's time for a new beginning," I replied, a sense of clarity settling over me. "But first, I need to lay Edward to rest properly." With the help of Dr. Bennett, we arranged a small memorial service for Edward Langley, inviting those who had known him and those who wished to pay their respects. It was held in the very chapel where we had confronted his spirit, now restored and filled with light instead of shadows. Standing before the gathered crowd, I felt a surge of emotion as I recounted Edward's story, the injustice he had suffered, and the triumph of finally clearing his name. There wasn't a dry eye in the room as people began to understand the depth of the wrongs that had been righted. As the ceremony concluded, I approached the altar, holding the watch in my hand. I placed it gently atop the memorial plaque we dedicated to Edward, feeling a profound sense of closure. The air seemed to shimmer with a soft warmth, and for a fleeting moment, I felt Edward's presence beside me, a silent nod of gratitude and farewell. In the days that followed, I found myself slowly adjusting to a life no longer overshadowed by fear and uncertainty. I began to reconnect with friends and family, sharing my story and finding comfort in their support. Cedarville felt different now, its streets no longer haunted by whispers of the past, but instead filled with a renewed sense of hope and community. Though the watch was laid to rest, I couldn't ignore the lingering curiosity and fascination with the supernatural that had taken root within me. Inspired by my experiences, I decided to channel my newfound knowledge into something meaningful. With Dr. Bennett's guidance, I began documenting the stories of others who had encountered the paranormal, offering them the same understanding and support that had helped me through my darkest moments. My journey was far from over, but it was no longer fraught with the terror of the unknown. Instead, it was a path of discovery, one where I could use my experiences to help others confront their own fears and face the shadows that lurked within their lives. And though I knew that darkness would always exist, I was no longer afraid. I had faced the depths of despair and emerged stronger, armed with the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, there was always the possibility of redemption and light. As I stood on the threshold of my new beginning, I took one last look at the horizon, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. Edward Langley's spirit had been set free, and in doing so, he had freed me as well. The echoes of the past had finally faded, leaving behind a future filled with promise and possibility.